Hey, y'all, come on up. Come on up. Get cozy. We got some empty seats. It's also because I'm not going to be able to stand uh, very long. So if you want to, I need to sit. Yes. I'm going to take the stole off. It's not mine. I stole it. It's a stolen stole. Borrowed it from the closet o' stoles. Yes. There, Bob had them. Can we have one of the handhelds, please? Sorry.
Yeah, this will be good. Thank you, everybody, for staying to get more information about our friend, the Reverend Lauren Jewett. Just as by way of introduction, and then I'm going to hand this over to Pastor Lauren. I met Pastor Lauren in seminary. We were attending Pacific School of Religion, and pretty quickly in our process, we were like, oh, I think we're the same kind of people. Like, you're my people. It's kind of what I was thinking. And so we got out into all kinds of good conversations and good trouble together. And we graduated together in May of 2018 and kind of went our separate ways, as one does, leaving grad school and going on to the next thing. And all of a sudden, I ran into her at an Our Whole Lives training in Berkeley. She was there to get training for one level, and I was there to get training for another. And then I began to think, well, I'm here to teach Al, and we need other people to teach Al. I wonder, do you think we could teach Al together? And so we did, and then we did it again, and then we did it a third time. Pastor Lauren has been a companion of our young people for the last 5 years, and nothing perhaps can be more difficult or challenging to talk about than sexuality and sex. And Pastor Lauren is talented and skilled and has a deep compassion and passion for companioning young people. And when you talk about those things and you do it so respectfully and so well and with humor and compassion, that builds trust. And so we were able together to build a environment of trust with those young people. And since the transitions that have been happening here, we've needed someone to help maintain continuity with our commitment to our work with young people and supporting their families. And I'm like, actually we kind of both at the same time and crossing, we're like, I wonder if we could work together in a new way or in an additional way. And so that led the church leadership to extending a kind of a contract agreement while we got the senior pastor thing settled so that we could continue to deliver in our commitment to them through things like youth group and service projects and faith formation. And you've seen Pastor Lauren showing up in worship over the past few months and holding space in youth group. And now we have a new opportunity in front of us. We'll talk more about that later, but just in the service of thinking where we could go, we want you to have an opportunity to actually get to know Pastor Lauren in maybe a deeper way than you've had by what you've read or hearing her in worship. You'll get to hear her preach next week. Homily, which, homily is still shorter than a regular. Anyway, she's going to preach.
My homily will be way shorter.
Going to be way shorter.
Although I say that now, and then I might, curse myself.
Yeah. They're not too concerned about the length. That's mostly just an inside joke. But you'll get to hear that next week. But today, we want to invite you to share your best 5 to 7 of what you want to share about them. And then I've got some questions to kind of extend the conversation. Be thinking of your questions, things that you think of, and then we'll have a time to open it up for folks to share. You still have your headset on, so you don't need this?
Yes, I do. Yes, which is nice, because then I don't have to hold something. It's really nice to see you all. to be here with y'all. I'm still adjusting to being here in worship, even though, like Todd said, I've been kind of behind the scenes here for at least, going on 5.5 years now. But I'm usually here when none of you are here, right? I'm just here when we're over in the other very green youth room, talking about sex and other things. So, yeah, I know. I think some of you are like, I would love to never be in that room when that conversation is happening. But watch out. So yeah, I feel like I've been a part of this congregation for the last 5 years, but I recognize that so many of you are really new faces to me because that work has been behind the scenes, not on Sunday mornings. And also throughout those 5 years, most of the time I've been living in Davis, so it's also been, usually I was just here to teach OWL, but more recently I've been able to come and be here for worship, which has been really awesome. So I guess my best 5 to 7 on who I am. Well, I think the most important thing to know is that it has been clear to me, even when I was considered a youth myself, that my call was to work with people younger than me, predominantly. And so I'm in my mid-30s now, but I've really been working with young people younger than me for 20 years. And that's partly because I grew up in a state where people start working when they're like 14, 15. So I was teaching and lifeguarding and babysitting and all sorts of stuff when I was a teenager myself. And so that work has started very early for me, and it's taken a lot of different forms over the years. But the through line for me has always been, how do I work with young people in a way that's healing, that's transformative, that's in a way that can be co-creative, that I'm not just coming in and saying, here's what we're doing, although in OWL we do kind of do that because there's a curriculum. But the idea is that it's something that we create together. I think some would say that that's sort of an emergent way of approaching the work, and I guess I would, if I had to add a label, it would probably be that I work in an emergent way. So if some of you are like, hey, what's the plan for youth group next week? I'll be like, we gotta see what bubbles up, see what the youth are needing. And that also means I'm not afraid to just pivot on a dime when there's clearly, even if maybe I've prepared a whole thing and it's clear that something else is needed, we'll just do that as best we can. But I for the last almost 3.5 years, I was working as a campus minister in Davis at an organization called Cal Aggie Christian Association. Cal Aggie Christian Association, because UC Davis is the Aggies. And that organization had been around for over 100 years, supporting college students in Davis. And so I had the real blessing to work for that organization and build the program back up after COVID. A lot got lost. One, campus ministry is challenging, just like youth ministry, because the kids cycle through really quickly. And in campus ministry, it's even more of a short-term time, because you don't get them from when they're kids to youth. You just get them in college, and then there's even more students that are coming in, transferring from community college. So sometimes you only get 2 years, So it's a timeline that just is constantly evolving, and I think it helped me learn how to adapt and kind of constantly be recreating the program, because it's constantly evolving. There's all this turnover. Sometimes you only have a student for a semester. In UC Davis's terms, for a quarter, so only 10 weeks, because they're like an international student who's just here for a quarter. So that felt really fast-paced, and yet we also had a housing, so we had 42 students that lived on our property in a multi-faith living community. So anyway, that was my last 4 years. I could say more about that. And prior to that, I worked as a chaplain in a pediatric hospital at UC Davis Medical Center. I was the pediatric chaplain, so I had the peds floor and the pediatric ICU and the surgery center and the peds a part of the emergency department, and really, if there were kids, I was around on that floor, and that was an intentional choice for me to do my CPE in a space where I'd be working with children, youth, and families, because I knew that that's where I wanted to continue moving forward in my career, working with that population. And while CPE is a really powerful experience in any context, and you can learn a lot, I wanted to do the learning specifically with those with that group of folks, rather than having to kind of translate the learning from maybe working with adults or folks in hospice or whatnot. And prior to that, I've been a coach. I've worked in Berkeley with disadvantaged homeless youth in Berkeley and Oakland. I've taught I'm like, I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, but basically, if there's something that there's a job to work with young people, I've probably done it in some capacity. And I think one of the things I feel also called to in the context of youth, like more specific youth ministry in a parish context, is to help not just our individual congregation here at Danville, but to kind of help the church in a wider way figure out what we need to do differently. Because I think when most of us think of youth ministry, we kind of picture this heyday of and I actually grew up in the tail end of that heyday back in Connecticut, but the days where we're going to have 20, 30, 40 kids in the pews on Sundays are basically over. That's just not going to happen. And so I'm really curious of how we can faithfully let go of some of those kind of sacred cows that we kind of idolize, right? We sort of think about oh, that's what it's supposed to look like. That's when it was thriving. And instead say, hey, we're going to honor all of the wonderfulness of that and recognize that that is not meeting the needs of our youth and our families now, and that those expectations are actually really holding us back from doing whatever it is that's going to be trying a new thing. And so there's a few times where I think I've already pushed back on a few things here, not in a forceful way, but in a way of hey, if the youth aren't into it, I don't really care how long the church has been doing it. If they're not showing up, if they're not excited, if it's not connecting with them, either we need to approach it in a different way, or we need to say, oh, that's not the thing this year. There might be a time where we come back to that. But that means the program is gonna adapt and shift and change, and that's based on needing the youth's input and what do they want their experience to be like here. I know Todd in his sermon today mentioned that there's a thing we get here that we don't get anywhere else. And our youth, we talked about that openly a few weeks ago because I wanted to understand what makes you show up? What is the thing that gets you here? Is it the food? Is it because you think Pastor Todd or I are cool and you want to hang out with us, which is definitely not the reason that they show up. I think JoJo is maybe a reason on occasion. Flashlight tag is a very high motivator. But really they're able to articulate this is the only place in my life where I get to just show up and I don't have to do anything. I don't have to do anything to earn my spot here, right? In school, you have to perform, you have to do your homework. If you're on a sports team or whatever, there's something you have to do to show up, right? And I think even with their friends, they feel like they're having to put on sometimes masks of okay, well, I can't be my full self. And definitely can't figure out who that is because it's not necessarily a safe space for me to experiment. I know some of our youth have really good friendships and do have that space, but they get to just be at youth group. And sometimes I think that for those of us on the outside, we can be but is that enough? Is that enough for youth group to be that? Don't we need to teach them things about our faith and church and all of this? And I would say yes, at its very basic level, it has to just be a space where they can be. And that I believe that that communicates what we believe, what we value as a community, the showing, the modeling of that, rather than the talking explicitly about it. Although there will always be times where we can kind of sneak in an explicit, like, hey, this is why we do this thing, right? Or these are the beliefs that inform why we do it this way, but that it's not overly didactic, because they're getting that for 8-9 hours a day, 5 days a week in school, and sometimes even more after if they're in other extracurriculars, especially that are very like head focused. So I could say more. I hope you all have questions. I know Todd has questions. But I'm excited about the possibility to be here, to get to see what we as a community can co-create in terms of building a container for young people, and then what I and Todd and Sid and some of the other folks that are occasionally involved in youth ministry, how we can use that container to build even more with our young people, and furthermore, how we can connect with other groups in the community who have young people, and where we can mutually support each other's work. We can offer space, and I have no idea what that's going to what that might look like in concrete terms. Like, I can't say to you like, oh, well, I talked to so and so at this organization, and we're going to do this event together. We haven't gotten there yet, but the first step is reaching out, is building relationships, is saying, hey, what are your kids struggling with? Here's what our kids are struggling with. What are your kids really excited about or want to try and make happen, and how can we maybe support each other in that work? Because ultimately, I care so much more about young people having a space where they can belong, period, than about whether they're ever going to get confirmed here. Because also there's a much higher chance that they will want to be confirmed if they have that rooted belongingness, and they don't have to, right? There's not that pressure. I love that there were 2 kids that came up during communion, and 2 of them didn't want grape juice. And I love that I get to say, this is a place where you don't have to get the grape juice. we're not going to tell you you're doing it wrong, because you can have metaphorical grape juice. If you don't like the taste, we're not going to force you to do something that you don't like, that makes you uncomfortable. And at the same time, we're going to, at times, push you to try new things, right? We're not going to only protect you from all discomfort, but we're going to respect your own agency and also kind of push you towards wherever the growing edge is at the same time.
So the first 2 questions that I have, I just want to mine a little more, give you opportunity to go a little deeper on some of the things. But what I want to begin at this point is saying is, you know how you meet a pastor or someone who's in ministry and you're like, wow, you've really found your calling. This is your thing. This kind of work is clearly Pastor Lauren's calling. I've known her a long time in a variety of educational settings and in some justice ministry work, but I know I've seen her engage with young people. Like, this is her gift. This is her calling, and what she's good at. One of the things that you're good at. So just stepping back to some of the information that you shared as it pertained to your interactions with the young people here and people at this church, just what is your kind of philosophy of how have you engaged with them, especially outside the OWL context and into the broader youth group context? What's kind of your method of engaging with young people?
I think if I had to sum it up in one word, I'd say relationship, which has been, because of the constraints of me having a full-time job up until 2 weeks ago in Davis, working with 100 college students, I haven't quite been able to live into that as much here. And some of that is a time constraint because my contract is limited, and my time was limited, which we talked about when we came up with that model. But I've found myself noticing, like, oh, I I need more time. I want more time. I would love to, like, I mean, I can speak to what that looks like with the college students, which is what my hope is to replicate that kind of thing here, which is every fall when we had a new cohort, I would work my tail off to get each and every one of them to have coffee or tea or froyo or something with me, so that we could have a one-on-one conversation. Because there was really clear, like anecdotal, but very clear data that the students who'd met with me one-on-one, they were so much more engaged in the program, so much more willing to reach out to me, connect with me. They would show up to events, and really got to utilize me as a pastor in their life. And some of the power of those conversations were that I got to model exactly how they could talk to me or what they could talk to me about, because this generation of young people, many of them don't grow up in religious communities, and so they're like, "You're a pastor? What does that? Are you going to try and convert me? Like, what does that even mean?" And so it was lovely when one of them would be like, they'd come up to me like and kind of side whisper, be like, "Can I talk to you about my relationship?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, of course." Or, "Can I talk to you about my parents and what's going on with my parents?" Yeah, of course. Like, and lots of other things too. But my hope is that I can find ways, especially within the confines of Safe Church, to still have one-on-one conversations with our young people, and follow up on that, because the intimacy that gets created when there's not other distractions, and when also I get to just be fully present for them in that moment, I don't know, I don't want to use a money metaphor, but the thing that's coming to mind is like it like really pays dividends, because it shows, rather than me telling them, it shows them like, I'm here, I'm not distracted, I'm here for as long as we want to sit here and just talk about whatever, and I can ask you questions, you can ask me questions about myself, but it's the start of that relationship. And I think that also is how I think about community partnerships, is that it starts with, "Hey, I'm this person, you're that person, tell me about your life, like tell me about what you care about, what your work is." It's not me calling up somebody and immediately asking them for some favor or some partnership, right? There has to be some relationship built. But the not a downside, but just the reality of that is it takes time. It takes time. It doesn't happen like that. And then I think the other approach is this, it's relational and also co-creative, as I've spoke to. That like this evening, actually, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions about, like, what do you think about Advent, and what do you want to know about Advent, and what have you learned but maybe don't really understand, right? And figure out where they're at with that, and then go from there, and also get a sense of what they want the spring to look like, and talking to the seniors about, hey, we do this big senior celebration, but what matters to you? There's only 3 of you. Like, what we can really cater it to what the types of like ritual or celebration or food or place that would really excite you, and that's something that I hope to engage them in. But that also means a lot of prompting, because there's times where you're asking them questions that they actually don't have like a reference point to answer. So I don't know, that it means asking further questions or doing some brainstorming or giving them different ideas of what it could look like, and going from there.
So you talked about operating from a relational standpoint, a co-creative standpoint, and at the end of your kind of intro, you teased about what we might be able to do together. Can you talk about how you imagine employing those, I don't want to call them tactics, those approaches to ministry within this church, our young people, and perhaps young people outside this community, if you were to continue working with us in a more, what do I want to call it, more intentional role?
What I can imagine, and I haven't done the specific research to know the specific groups here in town, but like if I were to say tomorrow come into the office and be like, all right, I got to figure out who are the people in this community in Danville, in the wider county area, but like who are the people working with young people, both within religious communities, within school systems, within county offices, right? And I would try and just kind of send out, hey, I'm new here. I'm trying to figure out who's working with young people in a meaningful way, and partially because that work can be really, really isolating. And I've found that those of us who work with young people are almost always wanting to widen our circle of colleagues to just have more people that get it, that get how challenging it can be, and who you don't have to like explain stuff to. I've found that, especially with my campus ministry colleagues, like they just get it. We don't have to. And as much as I love my peers in parish ministry, like they don't get that work in the same way that I don't always get like the senior pastor stuff in the same way, because it's, at least for the last few years, I've been in a different context. So it would look like me doing a lot of reaching out, probably figuring out like where are the LGBTQ support groups around here, and do they have an event, and can I show up, and can I offer, or can Pastor Todd and I offer to do a one-off like religion and sexuality workshop, something that is probably very needed for that population, but often the folks that work in those contexts don't have the theological training to necessarily hold that space. And I'll say that, one of my successes in Davis was becoming really close to the staff that worked at the LGBTQ Center, enough that my very first full year there, they asked me to help read the names at the Lavender graduation, because they really just needed another warm body, but they were also like, oh, but you're used to talking in front of people and like holding space. So, and that was because I just sought to build a relationship and said, hey, how can I support the work you're doing? Because I care about your young people. And I think how I will approach the work of youth ministry in this congregational context is that, yes, I'm the youth pastor for these kids, but there's a way in which I think of myself as the youth minister for like the kids in the community. And that sometimes really opens doors when staff of non-religious orgs really have a sense of like, oh, you just care about me, and you care about my kids, and I need more people that care about me and care about my kids, and we'll figure out how to connect, and there's a lot of beautiful things that can arise from those relationships, but you have to start without having an agenda, with just wanting to build a relationship and then see where that goes.
So your response, I'm called to be a minister to these kids, but I actually want to function as a minister to all kids in our community. Like that's a shift from how this role is done and has been done in this church and many churches. I in this role could not actually see beyond that. I've felt like, I've got to. Even though I was pushing up against it. We've got to. I'm committing all these resources and all my time to this group of kids, and that group of kids is not expanding. It isn't about growth. It's about fruitfulness, about bearing fruit. And there is fruitfulness in ministry to our kids. But you're talking about something different. And I wonder if you could then speak to that philosophy as it applies to the broader church, and not in terms of growth and more members and more money, but in terms of who we are and what we are called to do. How does that kind of thinking pair up with the work that how could that kind of thinking, or how do you see that kind of thinking as it pertains to the broader church and our other ministries?
Yeah. Well, I think first thing I'll say, and that what I'm about to say is a lesson I think we all learned during COVID, which is the church isn't the building, right? We couldn't be together during COVID, and I think I remember hearing around that time people be like, "Oh yeah, the church isn't the building. Like we can still be the church and not be tied to this specific building or set of buildings." And I think for me, what the reason I became a minister and not a guidance counselor or a therapist for young people or kept coaching or whatever is that I think at its best, and I wrote about this in my ordination paper, that at its best, the church models the kind of community of belonging that doesn't exist in a lot of other places. And I say at its best because there's lots of contexts where the church doesn't model that, right? And what I'll tell you is that when you talk to most Gen Z kids about the church, they make the assumption about, oh, the church is just like totally doesn't know how to make me feel like I belong. And that's precisely why we have to figure out how to connect and show the possibilities of like true extravagant welcome. Like I in the newsletter a couple weeks ago, if any of you read my little column at the end, I said something about wearing duct tape flip-flops to Easter service. Like we need to be a church that lets a youth show up like that. And I say that because I was actually the kid that did that. I showed up to Easter Sunday in duct tape flip-flops, and my mom was horrified. Probably rightly so. But also, like, looking back, I now know that, like, I had sensory issues, and those shoes were the only comfortable pair of shoes I could wear. And it wasn't really about the, like, flaunting the requirements of dress. It was, or being a rebel. It was just like, this is what I need to be physically comfortable and able to be present in this space. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a funny little story, but we need to be the space where kids can show up with different colored hair and like ratty clothes and whatever it is, because what matters more than anything is that they're here. And what they're going to take away from that is feeling cared about and welcome and able to be here. And so I think that the church knows how to do this, but has, I think, we've gotten caught up in centering Sunday worship as like the only thing. And I know this church does lots of other things besides Sunday worship, but it's important that there's a single gathering that does get most of the community together. But in order for like the church, as in the wider church, to survive, it needs to figure out how to have this space and other spaces occupied as many hours of the week as possible by all sorts of different groups and people, and including young people. I'm on the board of a progressive campus ministry network that's started up, and we talk a lot about, like, if we don't capture young people in the next 5 to 10 years, there will not be a church in 20 to 30 years. Like there are already churches that are folding, that are dying, and in some of those cases they need to. Like they weren't thriving. They kind of did the work they needed to do in the community, and then others had stepped in to fill those spaces. And then there's other contexts where it's really tragic that these local communities could not sustain themselves anymore. And I don't say that in the sense of like, well, we need to be connected with young people now so that there's butts in the pews in 20 years. It's not that. It's that we need to let this generation not just be like, we can't just think of them as the future. We have to think of them as the here and now and let them inform what happens in 20 years. And there's not a playbook. Like each community has to figure out what that is on its own. But I also know that young people, in their hearts, they really desire intergenerational relationships. They desire to have not just relationships with their parents, and in some cases, the relationships with their parents are really hard or aren't actually fulfilling their like full emotional, spiritual needs, right? And so that's where, as a community, we can fill some of that, and just show up with that love and care and modeling. And I'll say that some of that is very research-based. I remember in college I was studying secondary education, and there's this one paper we read where they studied all the different interventions a young person could have in their life, like a young person who was struggling in school or struggling emotionally, and the single thing that made the most difference out of all the possible interventions, the most conclusive, was having one person in their life that just cared about them, period, like no agenda. And so sometimes that's a coach, sometimes that's a teacher, sometimes that's an uncle or a step-parent or an older sibling, but one person, that was the difference. Not all the extra funding or the extra material things or even like just the extracurricular programs themselves. It was the people. It was the people in those programs that had a relationship with a young person, that said, I'm with you in this. You're not alone in this. And even if there's limitations of what I can do in my role, like I am just rooting for you, and I'm here for you, and I'm here to help you figure out how to navigate it within the confines of like my role. And so a few weeks ago in worship, I wasn't joking, but I kind of said, like, guess what? You're all youth pastors. And I heard some like chuckles of recognition and chuckles of like, oh gosh, I'm nervous. Like, no, I'm not. But I think for us to become a community where young people want to be and feel like they can be a part of it, we all have to take that very seriously. That in a way, we all are youth pastors, in the same way that we're all children's ministers. And in the UCC, we have this theology of the priesthood of all believers, so we're used to understanding that it's not only the pastors that serve communion, right? There's lots of folks in the community that can do that, and that we care for each other. We have an understanding that it's not just this, Pastor Todd isn't just like somehow more sacred than the rest of us, or I'm like more sacred. Sure, we went to school and got this degree and did some stuff, but we're that's one way of saying it. Yeah.
So I hope you've been able to see kind of a correlation of looking for someone not to fill a position that's always been filled the way it's been, but to do a new thing that is coordinated with where I and the church leadership are imagining we could be. And so I was going to ask you a follow-up question to that, but I think everybody's kind of aware that this is possibly a way that we're going. And I want to put Barb and Kira on the spot. In case there's a process question, could you be prepared to answer maybe what this could look like if someone asks that? So questions, the mic, and then pass it over. Start with Nicole.
One of the things that I find very exciting about this is education for us. Our kids, many of us, our kids have moved away, and I feel disconnected from this part of the community, and I think that we still have a lot to give and a lot that we can do, but I need a little more help about what the kids now care about, not what my kids cared about 10 years ago, and how I can support that. So our education, I think, is really important as well, of you bringing some of that back and how we can be most meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's some things that are different generationally, but I know I'm in a sanctuary, but I'm going to swear. But I'm going to say that teenagers have the best bullshit detectors of anybody, the most sensitive BS detectors, which means that they can tell when you're not being authentic, and that's when they're going to check out. But if they get to see you being your authentic, whoever you are self, and being that unapologetically, they will connect with that, and they'll feel more permission to be themselves. So I would say that, like, if anything, if you're not sure what to do, just truly be yourself, and be honest, and be sort of vulnerable, and tell them about the times that you're world felt like it was falling apart because he failed out of chemistry, like Betty told them a couple weeks ago. But it's that authenticity, and it's a permission for them to just exist, right? So if you're authentic with yourself and you don't show up with like judgment for them, you're like 98% of the way there. It doesn't matter if you don't understand TikTok. I don't have social media. Like, I'm a youth pastor who doesn't have social media because I just can't be bothered. So you don't have to know all of that stuff to connect with them, and they'll be happy to teach you about it too.
So I have 3 different types of, they might be 3 questions, I hope not. But I have kids of my own that you've helped with OWL, and they certainly learned a lot. And right now they're adults, so they're possibly Pastor Todd's problem. But
Nah, they're still mine.
okay. So my young adults are incredibly suspicious of church.
Rightly so, in many ways.
They have seen so much of churches that don't accept everyone, that no matter how many times I bring them here, they still feel like when religious talk comes out that
Right.
there's some judgment happening. So my curiosity is, how do you deal with those shy kids who maybe are a little suspicious of what you're trying to do?
I would say I would try and have a conversation specifically about that suspicion, and also affirm that suspicion and say that suspicion is welcome here. And there's some things that you should be suspicious of. There's some things that are said in the name of God, in the name of religion, that all of our hackles should go up.
Right,
And we
right.
should be suspicious of. And so it's healthy to be suspicious, I think, of that. And then the question is, after that, well, what do you want from this experience, or this being a part of this community that maybe you're not getting, or how can we? Are there ways that we need to model different language in this sanctuary? Not every time, but like, do we need to alternate the different ways we talk about things so that it feels like there's a more of an abundant way of understanding theology? And while there's such important tradition in using some of the same words that have been said for hundreds, thousands of years, there's also space to say it in ways that might resonate differently with some people.
Great. And then I have students that I've taught during what we were calling donuts and devotions. And I feel like our students are very well educated about church, and maybe not so much about the individual stories, but about diversity and how to accept people. And I'm wondering how you take these there are some very, very bright kids in our church who know a lot. And how do you handle those kinds of kids?
Same way. Let them ask the questions, let them share their knowledge. I mean, some of our kids are more wise than I am about some things. Truly.
Yeah.
Like, there's times where I walk away from youth group and I'm like, whew, I feel like I've just got like a sermon of challenge. And it's not usually a whole conversation, right? It's like a line here or seeing how they support each other that just reteaches me the things that I'm saying, but I also need to see it echoed back to me. But have it, the permission of space to do that. And I think, kids and teenagers especially, and young adults, they know when they're being tokenized. They know when it's like, oh, we're gonna have you do the youth sermon so that we feel good that we have a youth up there and we get to all sort of like watch this like exotic teenager in the sanctuary. They know when it's that versus when it's like, we want to hear what you have to say. There's a difference in intentionality around that. And that's some of what, as adults in this congregation, we might try and think through, like, what commitments do we need to make about how we behave in this space to make it feel more authentic and welcoming. And I don't necessarily have any answers to that right now, partly because this congregation has overall had a really like consistent, healthy youth ministry program. Even if it's been kind of small, there's been a space, and there's been people in this congregation who are really committed to that. And there's things we can learn. There's things that we can shift that also will likely make lots of other people who aren't teenagers maybe feel more welcome, or challenge us to think about something in a different way, or allow us to have the grace to understand that, like, oh, the words that are being used today, those don't speak to me, but I know that they might be like really speaking to someone else in this sanctuary this morning, and we need to understand that every single part of the worship service doesn't have to be for us as individuals, right? And that's something that I think is really important for us when it's like, oh, that sermon didn't land. It might have been the best sermon someone else has ever heard, or that person really needed to hear, and that we get to hold that space for each other. And that's true for young people as well. I know there's a few other folks that have questions.
This is maybe more a comment, but when we were on the search committee for Todd's, and our youth were there, and one of the things that they had wanted was they would like to have inter-church functions that you would be doing with the local churches. And when you mentioned that was one of the things you wanted to do, that was very important when they brought that up, that they felt that was necessary. So we're behind that very much.
A lot of churches are, because there's this fear that, like, oh, but then they might steal our kids, and like our kids might go there instead, which honestly, if that happens, I'm like, then they found their place. That's okay. And it might be the other way around, but one of the blessings I had working in my previous role was that it was an ecumenical organization and a multi-faith organization. And so for the last 3+ years, I just kind of like got really used to swimming in ecumenical spaces. Like I'm the only non-Methodist on the United Methodist Campus Ministry Association board. Like, and I'm not a token UCCer. It's more that I live in California and they need somebody on the West Coast. But to get to work amongst other congregations that have enough shared values, I think there's a lot of possibility there. And we would, both in this church and then also in my role as in the conference that is I guess technically started today. My hope is to model how we can, one way, not the only way, but one way of how we can do that here that helps other conferences or other regional bodies or other congregations from the standpoint of Danville. Like, how can we be courageous enough to try some new stuff and put some money towards it? I mean, because that's some of what we're talking about, right? Because, like, I need to be able to pay my rent, and also this all doesn't just like happen without an like a financial investment, but my like really strong belief is that investment will pay off. I don't know exactly how, but that we will see things in 17, 18 months. And probably it'll be just based on it being 18 months, a year and a half. It's actually not that much time. But we'll see, my hope is that in 18 months, should you call me into this role, that we'll see the roots of the next thing, like the next thing. It's not going to be, I'm not going to be able to create like a ton of stuff in 18 months, but I might be able to build some foundational stuff that then we can, in 18 months, as a community, assess, okay, what's next? Because I'm not a miracle worker, right? And this is a part-time job, so so we have to have realistic expectations, but also be like bold enough to have that vision and not like, oh no, we're afraid that if we do this, it's going to be a bad investment. Well, you know what? For the like 5, 10, 15 young people, it's probably going to be my hope is that it's something that changes their life. Probably not in ways that they even understand yet, but in ways that they look back on, or when they're in a time of trouble, they remember. And that, you can't put a price tag on that. You really can't. There's a question here.
I got one on the way by.
Okay, well, Bob, go for it.
Lauren, are there any lessons to be learned from the evangelicals that seem to be attracting a lot of kids today?
Yes, probably. One is branding. They can have a, so what, this Progressive Campus Ministry Network I'm a part of, it's called Zoe. And the idea is that there's all these progressive campus ministries, but they're split up amongst 6 or 7 different denominations, and some of them aren't denominationally affiliated at all, whereas the evangelicals have national branded, like they have InterVarsity, they have, it's called Cru now, but it used to be called Campus Crusaders for Christ. They have the Navigators, right? They have this recognizable, it's like they're like the NFL team in terms of their branding. And our camp, in comparison, our campus ministers are like the local like rec basketball league, right? Or I'm mixing metaphors, local rec football league. And so I think, and they have a way of communicating their identity somewhat facetiously at times, and sometimes like very blatantly facetiously, like saying, oh, you belong here, but then once people the kids get connected, they're like, oh, actually, wait, I totally don't, but I've already made these friends, and I really like these friends, and so I'm gonna just kind of shut down that part of myself in this space until I graduate, because I really like these friends I've made. And there's some trickiness to it, which I would never want to replicate. But they also have, some of it is like they have big, sexy, flashy things in their churches, right? Or like a whole band, not an organ, but like a whole jazz band or a whole rock band or whatever. And I think there's some lessons learned there, but what they're doing well is they're still figuring out how to help people feel like they belong. Now, my young adults who've been refugees from those programs would say that it's actually not true belonging, because there's some people who cannot belong and be their full, thriving, healthy selves. Like those programs kill kids. There's kids that don't survive those programs, both youth and young adult, and I mean, that's true of adults as well. But there's something they're capturing in terms of their ability to sort of say, hey, this is who we are, we're so awesome, don't you want to be a part of it? And one of the challenges in a more progressive space is that we don't have like a dogmatic faith, right? And so like when I used to have to table on campus, it would just, I'd be adding all these caveats to like what I was saying, like, oh, well, we're welcoming, and we're welcoming like explicitly of these people, or, you know, having to kind of contextualize things. And I think the evangelical groups don't feel the pressure to do that. They feel like they can just say these really global things and not have to add caveats or context. So I'm not entirely sure how we do that, but I think one thing is we need to not be afraid to boldly claim who we do know we are, and have really clear visual indicators or other indicators in our programs, and programs I mean like in the bulletin, in any kind of publication, and the walls of the church. Like we have to be able to signal that, and not have people come in and be like, are you really? And then they have to kind of like ask somebody, you know, but to make it really clear. And I think there's some pretty easy, that's an easier thing to do, I think.
When you first started talking about, you know, all the ideas that you have, the first thing that came to my mind is thinking about like, how do you define a successful program? And I think we've struggled with that for, you know, for a long time at this church, shifting our thinking away from, you know, what are measures of success, and is membership a measure of success? Is stewardship, you know, financial stewardship a measure of success? And yes, you need those things, but really starting to define yourself and your own interpretation of success is, who are you serving? How many people are you serving? For example, you know, on our campus every week we serve 100 families
Right.
with young children. Is that part of our identity up here of who are we serving? And so I really identify with your philosophy of going out. And we serve all youth in this community, not just the youth that come on Sunday night
Right.
or whose parents are members or whatever. So
Yeah.
I really like that philosophy of, you know, who are we serving, and that's the way we define ourselves. Thank you for letting me comment.
Yes. Yeah, but yeah, right? I mean, how do we, I believe that this congregation, and some of this is from my own experience of being welcomed. Like, you all know how to do this, because despite the fact that I work with youth, often I walk into a church and I get like accosted because people are like, oh my gosh, you're under 40, and like, sign the dotted line, join us. And I'm like, yo, I'm a pastor, I'm here to see my friend preach, or like, I'm helping lead the worship service. So I say that because honestly, my own experience here has been one of like respect and care and positivity and non-judgment. And so that to me means like, you already know how to do that in some ways. And there's probably ways we can get even better at it. But that's the hard part to teach churches, because I know there's some churches I walk into, I'm like, yeah, I'm never going there again, because there's too many implied, not explicit, but implied rules about how you're supposed to dress, or where you're supposed to, like, what your hair is supposed to look like, or what time you're supposed to get there, or, you know, there's too much, I don't know, too many rules of conformity, really, and I'm not interested in being a part of that. And I think there's some folks, some of you are probably sitting here and be like, I don't know, we look pretty uniform, like, we're pretty white, and you know, older people, and yes, and you can look like that and still be really welcoming and authentic in that welcome, and not tokenizing.
So could we appreciate Pastor Lauren for spending some extra time with us? I'm going to invite you to direct questions about process to our moderators, Kira, Barb, and Aline, and some of that information is in your bulletin. We will continue to communicate that with you. But what I want to stress to you that this is a shift in how we do ministry with young people. Not that our commitment is a shift. We are committed to these young people, but in a shift in the way we do programming with young people that is integrated with the rest of the church in a very intentional way. What Lauren will be doing in contexts related to youth, I will be doing in other areas of the community, in ways that Lauren is creating spaces of belonging. Well, that's what we do well. We're doing that, and we're seeing that bear out now. So if you have questions, reach out to the moderators. Lauren's email, lauren@danvillechurch.org, just like mine. I think your phone number is in there. Not sure if it is.
Yeah, we can add it.
But I encourage you, the time frame is shrinking, and I encourage you to get those questions out. And then as you're out in this community and folks are wondering what's going on, well, now you know some stuff, and encourage you to do that work of socializing what's ahead of us. Let's offer a brief blessing and then send everybody out to the rest of their day. Holy God, we thank you for surrounding us with blessedness. We honor you and witness the fruit of our own blessedness being visible, tangibly visible in the community. God, we ask your blessing on each of us as ministers, on the ministers who are called to work within and through this church. We ask your blessing on Pastor Lauren as she ministers to our young people, and as seeds are planted, as she imagines what a ministry here looks like, and the fruit that might come from our collective efforts with her working alongside us. God bless us, those of us who are going to eat, going forth into the rest of our day, and let let your love shine through us. And we pray this in your many names. Amen.
Amen.